Okay, we're going to get started. My name is Wendy. I'm from the Interpretation Technical Assets Resource Center here at the Asian Pacific Islander Institute on domestic violence. And today we're going to be doing a webinar on how to work with interpreters. Before I get started, I just want to hand over to Nancy from the Institute just to give you some background about what the Institute does.
Hi everybody, this is Nancy. I'm the program coordinator here at the Asian Pacific Islander Institute on Domestic Violence. Welcome to our webinar today. Just a little bit of background on the API Institute. We are a national resource center and technical assistance provider on gender-based violence, including domestic violence, sexual violence, and trafficking in Asian and Pacific Islander communities. And our expertise comes from, it's really grounded in understanding the dynamics of abuse unique to API cultures and communities, and recognizing that the high prevalence rates of domestic violence in API communities are complicated by isolating social, cultural, and systemic barriers, and also understanding that it's diverse ethnic, demographic, linguistic, and cultural diversity within APIs. What you can reach out to us for includes technical assistance, consultation, and training. If you're looking for research and data, analysis and policy reviews of trends in gender-based violence, and also resource materials, please contact me at nwan@apii-gb.org. We work with a lot of critical issues like trafficking, abusive international marriages, familicide, and transnational abandonment, but also with vulnerable populations within API communities like LGBTQ individuals, Muslims, elders, refugees, and people with limited English proficiency, which we'll cover today. And thank you for joining our webinar, and I'll turn it back over to Wendy.
Okay, we're going to, okay. So, just to give some background, we have a grant from the Office of Violence Against Women to provide technical assistance and training for language access. Many of you met Cannon before for language access planning, and then I'm assisting with interpretation and working with interpreters. So to get started first, we're going to start with a video. It's going to be a
mía, para el mismo se dire que le maniement de faux-billets est puni par les travaux forcés en perpétuité. Ich mache Sie darauf aufmerksam, dass das für das Yo le quiero hacer saber a usted una cosa, que el que falsifica dinero va a la cárcel por trabajo forzado para toda la vida. I want you to know something. Now, the penalty for counterfeiting is the imprisonment, life imprisonment and hard labor.
Do I look like a counterfeiter?
Esto es ridículo. Yo me parezco una falsificadora. Sí, sí, Ferru. Ich bin nicht Geld. Es ist die Lehre, die Telefonmanier.
Okay, just to have some comments about this video, did anyone see anything wrong with the interpretation and what's wrong with interpretation in this video? If you could just type in your comments in the public chat. Well, for one thing, using the drunk guy as the interpreter is probably not the best way to facilitate communications between two individuals. And then the second point are the amount of dramatization and facial expressions used in this language interpretation. So most interpreters will not be so animated when they do their interpretation. Another thing I just want to point out, and we'll talk about later, is relay interpretation. And that this is a great example of relay interpretation of using different languages. So that's a good example of interpretation. And going back to the presentation. So the goals and topics I'd like to cover today is to inform all of you what good interpretation looks like, the different modes, working with telephonic interpreters, best practices, and hopefully at the end you'll understand what the ethical obligations are of interpreters, the difference between bilingual individuals and interpreters, and providing screening tools and considerations for evaluating interpreters. The terms I'm going to be using are from the Interlanguage Roundtable, which we'll talk about. Instead of using the terms fluency to describe the skill, I'm going to break it down to professional proficiency, which means the ability to speak the language with sufficient structural accuracy and vocabulary among many topics, but not quite at the level that they'll understand cultural aspects of a native speaker. Now, native proficiency means that they have that cultural standard, and it's a very well-educated, higher level of proficiency. The term target language I'm going to use is language used by the limited English proficient individual. So just to dispel some myths, we're going to ask for some feedback here. Just want to get some feedback from you. So true or false, just because you're a bilingual means you can interpret. And in just a minute. All of you could click whether it's true or false, and then we can see. So, great. Most of you who answered, it is false. Just because you are bilingual doesn't mean that you're an interpreter. Bilingualism is one step to become an interpreter, but it takes more than that, and we'll go over the different skills that it takes to become an interpreter. Okay, so next question. True or false, high proficiency in the target language is the most important. So please click either true or false on the pie chart We'll see what you guys get. So we seem to be a little split here, and while high proficiency in the target language is important, it's also important to realize that English is just as important. High proficiency in English is just as important as high proficiency in the target language. Another point I want to make is interpretation versus translation. We see that interpretation is spoken conversion from one language to another, and translation is written conversion from one language to another. And many times we will use those terms interchangeably, but there is a distinct difference between interpretation and translation. So in a nutshell, what does good interpretation take? It takes high level of proficiency in both the target language and English, knowing and adhering to a canon of ethics, neutrality, training, as well as being articulate, meaning an individual who's able to speak clearly without using a strong accent as well. And we'll go over these more in detail throughout the webinar. So how do we measure proficiency? We at the Institute suggest using the Interagency Language Roundtable self-assessment that the State Department uses, and it's a cheap way to assess proficiency in both English and the target language. What the individual does is that there are a series of questions, and these are some of the samples that they can answer yes or no to. And depending how many yeses they score, they're given a scale between 1 through 5, 1 being the least proficient, 5 being the highest, 5 being native proficiency, to see what their language skills are like in the target language. So 3 is what we recommend as a good, using an interpreter in a legal setting in interviews, but it's good to determine what you decide to use an interpreter for, whether it's outreach or interviewing. This is a subjective test because the individual is doing a self-assessment. So in order to have more detail and more feedback, we often suggest pairing this with a bilingual speaker as well to assess the target language. But it's also indicative of English as well. Many of these questions, besides these, they contain a lot of vocabulary and terminology that are not used in, let's say, daily conversation. So if you notice that an interpreter is having a very difficult time going through the English vocabulary, that might be a sense that their proficiency in English is not as high as it needs to be for an interpreter. So there are tests in listening and speaking and reading, and coupled with that is also interpretation skills. And the link is down here below if you need to look at some of the tests. So level 3 is probably going to be general proficiency, which means that they're able to describe scenarios, they have a good structure, they're fluid in their speech, but they're not, they have, in topics that are difficult, they will not have a little bit of trouble interpreting. Next, we're going to talk about modes of interpretation. There are 3 modes that are most commonly used. Simultaneous, the process of orally rendering one language into another language at the same time, is often seen in, let's say, UN conferences or when there's a conference with many speakers wearing headsets. So there's no stopping between an English speaker and the interpreter. Consecutive interpretation is the process of orally rendering one language into another language after the speaker has completed a statement. So these interview settings take a little bit longer with consecutive interpretation, as one person has to stop and the other person speaks again. It's most often used in interviews, consecutive, and it's a lot easier for many interpreters to start with consecutive rather than continue to go into simultaneous. The other modes of interpretation are sight translation, where you hand an interpreter maybe a written document and the individual converts that into spoken speech in another language. Does anyone have any questions at all so far? Nope. Okay. So code of ethics, and the code of ethics and professional conduct for interpreters is really fundamental when we talk about interpreter skills building and the basis of what it takes to be an interpreter. It must be abided by regardless of certification or registration, and it instills that fundamental principles of neutrality that makes an interpreter the facilitator. I'm not going to go through all of them, as some of them will come out later, but the ones I want to highlight: accuracy and completeness. This means interpreters will not admit anything: cursings, insults, mumbling. So that goes for both sides. If you decide you're working with an LAP individual and you decide to make some comment about the way that they're dressed, the interpreter will interpret that as well. Same for the LAP individuals. If they're asking opinions about you, the interpreter will interpret that. Conflict of interest. There's no summarizing in accuracy and completeness. Summarizing leaves a lot for the interpreter to give judgment and to explain things, which is not part of their role. Conflict of interest. As an interpreter, remember they're a neutral party and they will not advocate or provide any sort of advice. And that also relates to impartiality. So interpreters are not cultural brokers, nor they should be asked their opinions. So if you were to ask the interpreter, do you think the client is lying? Do you think the client can really not understand English? That's asking for their opinion and being partial. And they're not allowed to do that. Conflict of interest is also important because if they may know the individual in small LAP communities, the individual may feel it's not appropriate to speak about their current situation. And which brings us to confidentiality. Confidentiality is important in a lot of smaller communities as word travels very fast. So the idea that this interpreter and the LAP individual may know each other and is a huge private case, there's a risk that an interpreter may start gossiping. So what we recommend is that if there's a confidentiality agreement, confidentiality form that for your organization that the interpreter can sign to ensure that they will keep everything that's being said confidential. Does anyone have any questions about the Code of Ethics before we go on? Another way to use the Code of Ethics is we have samples of them as well, to have an interpreter that you're going to use review them, sign it in person, or if you're using a telephonic interpretation service, ask the telephonic interpretation service to provide a Code of Ethics to ensure that all their interpreters are abiding by a certain code. And like I said, so we can definitely provide samples of Code of Ethics that you'd like to use for your interpreters. So we're going to go through some preparation for working with interpreters. Have you had an opportunity to speak with LAP individuals? This is sort of prepping, making sure that they're comfortable working with LAP individuals. The one I want to highlight here, though, is familiarity with dialects and idiomatic peculiarities. An individual, we're going to use Chinese as an example. So an individual may indicate he speaks Chinese when in fact he speaks a Chinese dialect. And this is usually a regional language that's separate from the original language, official language. Chinese is generally associated with Mandarin, but an LAP individual who lives in maybe a different province may be more comfortable in a dialect, such as Cantonese or Shanghainese. These dialects are very different from Spanish, and we find them in Spanish as well. And so these dialects are very different from Mandarin. And a Mandarin interpreter, if you were to ask for a Chinese interpreter, you'd probably provide the Mandarin interpreter. The Mandarin interpreter would not be able to facilitate communications between a Cantonese speaker and an English speaker. A way to sort of solve this is to see whether the interpreter can introduce themselves to the LAP individual and get a sense of their language skills. It also may be that the LAP individual has received schooling in the official language, but is more comfortable with the dialect. So interpreters should assess right away, well, they're speaking a dialect and I'm speaking Mandarin. I don't speak that dialect. You need to get someone who speaks the dialect too. So it's getting to the root language and getting to know the different ways that interpreter can be used to prepare for an interview. Again, going back to the code of conduct, ensuring that when you're working with an interpreter that they've read the code of conduct, whether it's in court or whether it's the code of conduct that you have for your organization. Have them explain what that means, have them explain the topics that are covered, and going through any conflict of interest questions as below. Do you know the parties? Have you ever been could you be a potential witness? Do you have any other potential conflicts of interest with the community? Or have you worked with the parties before? In small communities, maybe the same interpreter is being used in very many different interviews. So it's good to know what the relationship is as you progress and be observant in your client's change in demeanor if, let's say, there's topics that are uncomfortable. In summary, so far, the qualified interpreter would have these requirements. So I suggest that you use this as sort of like a template for checklist when you're working with interpreters. Proficiency, we talked about, whether they know consecutive or simultaneous modes, the wide range of vocabulary and terminology in the setting in topic you're using. Cultural nuances, regional variations, that goes to dialect. Proper pronunciation, making sure they're clear, articulate, that both parties understand. And again, ensuring that they follow interpreter ethical standards. When an interpreter comes in, it's best to see kind of their experience beforehand. Some of them may be certified, and when they say certified, ask them what language certification and what state are they certified in. That's different from registration. Registration depends on the state, and each state has their own requirements as well. For example, California, you can be a registered interpreter if you just pass an English writing test. So, and in Guam, basically, you're registered if you pass an ethics exam. So it's very different, and that should give you a sense of how skilled it is, and to making sure that they show some kind of proof. There are many interpreters who have not been certified or registered and have just done interviews in, let's say, a legal setting between attorneys and clients or a conference setting, and they may have attended community trainings or volunteer trainings. So it's important to get a certificate if they have one, or a contact information from where they got the training, if they have any documentation, or to know what was covered in that training, just so you know that they know the difference of the modes, that they know the ethics and the basics that are covered. If you're going to, for many times, besides proficiency, you can assess the interpreter's case if they don't provide any documents. Have a bilingual person assess, identify, let's say, what you need them for. For example, if you need them from an interview setting, ask them if they've worked in previous interview settings before. Ask them to go through any glossaries or dictionaries. If you have an article or text you want them to cite translate. Or you can pay for professional assessment, which involves usually an individual calling a testing center and speaking over the phone to an individual. As I said before, continue to qualifying interpreters when you use them. Ask how often they've interpreted in the legal setting, whether it's in court, a different organization, how often. Ask them to describe their familiarity experience, just to get a sense of how qualified they are. Describe the experience or training in legal matters in English and other languages, and describe consecutive interpreting. So they're able to define consecutive, define simultaneous, define their experience. That probably means they're better qualified to suit your needs and have had training to be a qualified interpreter. We often are approached with questions on how to find interpreters before even qualifying interpreters. So for languages of lesser diffusion, rare languages, as different communities come in to the United States, many of these individuals speak multiple languages. For example, an individual from Guatemala, while they may speak their dialect, may also speak Spanish as well. So if they are able to speak Spanish, is there a way that you can find a Spanish interpreter to communicate? This may widen the pool locally, or if you need to go out of state, to determine that really is a matter of conflict of interest. If it's a small community of individuals, it may be better for a person out of state to come in and interpret. If you are going to do an out-of-state interpretation, realize your organizational technology requirements, ensure that there's a clear, a great phone you can use, a speakerphone, or we've had some people ask about Skype. That really involves using a good microphone, good video, good connection, but just to warn that not everything on Skype is confidential, so that may create problems. Relay interpretation, where you can find intermediate language, is what we saw in the Lucy video. That's an alternative if you can't find an interpreter that speaks a language of that's more rare listed diffusion. And other resources you can go search. Again, be aware of conflict of interest. But any universities or colleges that have language programs, we're putting together kind of a assessment list of resources that we hope to provide to everyone so they can see what language programs are available in your local area. Any sort of bilingual volunteers that may know somebody, or you can sit down with and explain what interpretation is required for, may be able to help as well. Again, telephonic interpretation and contracts. Questions at all so far? We can definitely help you also search for interpreters if you have a rare language. We have contacts, and we can outreach if you're looking for somebody specifically as well. We also do, if you have a set of bilingual volunteers, individuals in the community who are interested in interpreting, or you would like to build more skills training, we also provide training in basic interpretation skills for those bilingual volunteers. And that would involve going over the ethics, exercises, just so they have a basic foundation of when you're using them or what interpretation takes. So other requirements besides language proficiency. We're often used to thinking of interpreters as only people who can communicate between two languages, but there are other things that you should consider. The main thing I want to point out people to think about is physical health and emotional health. Physical health, being sure that they're not sick so they can speak clearly, that they don't have to take multiple breaks during their, while breaks are important, that they're not consistently taking breaks and interrupting the flow of the conversation. Emotional health, this is primarily important when you're doing interpretation for, let's say, a domestic violence setting or sexual assault setting. If they were previously DV individuals who are bilingual or are affected by trauma, sometimes this may trigger trauma during their interpretation, and which may cause them to cry during interpretation, which is not appropriate at all. So making sure that an interpreter is able to kind of control their feelings and has an emotional state that's ready to hear some of these stories that may trigger trauma. Professionalism, it's important for an interpreter, and as we train them, to be appropriate in the way that they're dressed and the way that they handle themselves when approaching the client and approaching the English speaker as well. So an interpreter candidate review, as we continue to kind of find qualifying interpreters, organizational qualifying questions. So these are usually determined specifically on what you as an organization would like the interpreter to do, whether it's primarily just interviews between an LAP individual, or whether it's more outreach, whether it's a meeting setting, and determining what skills they need. And we can assist you as well in determining the best specific way to qualify your interpreters. Getting a sense of their ability to absorb new material, or a sense to ability to respond to new potential problems. This involves sort of educating and making sure that they know specific terminology related to your area. If you're having a very technical interpretation, that involves a lot of legal terminology, ensuring that they have access to that material as well. Again, getting experience credentials and references include many of their trainings, or calling the trainers to get an agenda of curriculum. Observation for first-time interpreters, this may be good when you say you have to go to court. or you're using someone who's been in a court setting, seeing how that they performed previously may give you a sense of how they will react with LEP individuals or react to the client. Pre-session. We recommend that before you sit down with your LEP individual and interpreter, that you conduct a pre-session with the interpreter. And this is basically to set your expectations and just to be clear on the role of the interpreter and yourself. You can maybe create a template in your language access plan for this, and we can also help with the pre-session if you have any specific questions you'd like to get out. So qualifying questions we talked about, but very commonly during a pre-session you would state that you want everything to interpreted. Again, this is accuracy, completeness, false starts, mumbling, cursing, thinking out loud. This includes you and the client. Sometimes it is actually very important to stress that everything is confidential, and while attorneys are covered under the attorney-client privilege, that really depends on the state. So it's important to check your state first before stating this. Interpreter's role and your role as an advocate or attorney. So ensuring the interpreter remains neutral to the conversation and that you will be the one explaining, you will be the one directing the conversation. Hand signals. Sometimes when you're in the flow of the conversation, it's good to know when to stop for you and when the LEP individual needs to stop. Now, in some scenarios, working with domestic violence and sexual assault, an individual may be so overcome with emotion or so into their story that they may continue to just keep speaking, keep talking. And it is difficult to interrupt the individual while telling their story. In our perspective, though, if an interpreter is unable to follow the victim's story, then the story itself is actually not being told. So it is possible that you may want to speak to your LEP client beforehand to prepare them to speak slower, speak in shorter sentences, so as the interpreter can catch up and give the full detail of the story. It's also good to prepare an an interpreter for any sort of domestic violence, sexual assault interviews or areas. Oh, and also to assess their ability to do any sexual assault or DV. So this may be asking them if they've had any experience with DV or sexual assault. Another huge thing to ask is how comfortable they are in describing body parts. Many interpreters are not comfortable in describing body parts, which will lead to inaccuracy in your interpretation as well. Reviewing, again, going back to the pre-session, reviewing the interpreter role, ethics, and protocols, whether they have a dictionary or they're going to have a dictionary from you, what mode will be needed, so if they will prefer consecutive or simultaneous. And if there are any forms that you're asking them to cite translate, to do that ahead of time, as you want to be aware of any interpreter fatigue that will happen after the 2 hours. Give it to them, prepare them ahead, and let them know that there will be cite forms to translate during the session. And maybe give them something to look over, so if there's any terminology that they're not aware of, that they can look it up ahead of time before they do the cite translation of the form. So, working effectively as an interpreter, again, conduct a pre-session with your expectations. Positioning, I'll speak about a little bit later. As for noise, be aware that noise carries in many settings. For example, when you do outreach clinics or outreach events, interpretation